Good evening. It is Wednesday, June 6, 2018. It's 7:01 p.m., and this is the Hudson, New Hampshire Budget Committee. We're in the Buxton Community Development Meeting Room, and I call this meeting to order. Mr. Urrutia, would you please say the Pledge of Allegiance? Lead us.
Yes, I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Attendance. Present are Ted Trost, Joe Fernald, Grace Hopkins, Michael Fideli, Alejandro Urrutia, School Board Liaison Malcolm Price, and Board of Selectmen Liaison Norman Martin. We have a quorum. Excused are Bob Gesford, Lori Robichaud-Pagan, and Hassan Good. Also joining us this evening are Town Administrator Steve Malizia, Finance Director Kathy Carpentier, Assistant Assessor Jim Mashad, School Superintendent Lawrence Russell, and Business Administrator Karen Burnell. Welcome to all of you. It's time for public. Oh, Mr. Murray.
Me, Mr. Chairman.
What's that? I forgot you. Oh, you're checked off. I apologize. Mr. Murray is here.
It's all right.
So, public input. Is there any member of the audience who wishes to address the Budget Committee? There does not appear to be so. The next thing we have on the agenda are the reports from committees. School Board.
Only thing I have for the school board graduations coming up. This year we had a record amount of scholarships handed out. That's a good thing. We have the Buddy Dance is Saturday. This Saturday, which is a great event. There's also another awards spaghetti dinner on Monday night, which is going to be pretty good too for the students. All around, this year's been a great year as far as education. A lot of students graduating with some high honors.
Excellent. Anything else?
That's it.
Thank you very much. Board of Selectmen, Mr. Martin?
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the board. I have a few items for you. At our meeting on May 22nd, the Board of Selectmen took action on awarding a electrical utility portion to run the electricity to the gorilla cage to bury the line underneath to the gorilla cage for the electricity for the bathrooms in the amount of $50,750 to award that contract to Brian Mason Electric. We also had a public hearing on to accept the donation of an office trailer valued at $3,000, which will be stored at the firing range up on West Road to replace the one that's there that's old and gritty. We also accepted a $1,000 grant from Sam's Club for what they call the backpack program for students that that are in need of food when school's not in session. They have a program in this backpack. They go home with enough meals for the weekend so that they're nourished when they come back to school on Monday. And then last evening, the Board of Selectmen voted to give a 2% increase to 9 department heads, the only 9 department heads that we have in town, in the amount of $8,403, effective July 1st. The reason for this is compression, and we are taking the money from, we had budgeted for a land use director in 2019, and the Board of Selectmen have voted to hire a town planner, which is less money in salary. So we're gonna take that money from that salary line. And then the Board of Selectmen also, actually, let's say this, the voters voted in March to approve a 2% increase for the town clerk tax collector, which will become effective on July 1st as well. And you're also aware that the voters voted for a salary schedule. Well, there's no wording in the salary schedule of where the town clerk tax collector position should be right at this the year 9 max or where she should be. So the Board of Selectmen took into account the 2% increase that she's getting from the voters and where she stood currently, and we're gonna put her at year 3 of that schedule. And then each year in July after that, she'll go until she maxes out at year 9, even though she's an 11-year employee.
How long in that position?
She's been in it 11 years.
11 years in that position. Interesting.
So it would have been a very significant increase, and we decided to put her at the year 3 and go from there.
Okay.
You have any? Let me just make sure I have nothing else. That's it. Thank you.
I have a question.
Sure.
The electrical run to the Gorilla House, that work won't start until after July 1st, is that correct?
That is correct.
And the donation from Walmart, do you have an idea of how many students that money will allow you to help?
I do not.
Okay. Thank you. Any other questions or comments for the Selectman Liaison? Very good. Next on our agenda is the acceptance of minutes from May 9, 2018. Do I have a motion?
So move, Mr. Chairman.
Second.
Martin, seconded by Mr. Fidelli. Any discussion, corrections to the minutes? There appear to be none. Show of hands, all in favor of accepting the minutes for May 9, 2018? It's unanimous. Motion carries. Old business, none. New business. First up on new business, we have a presentation called the Three-Legged Stool, Appropriations, Revenues, and Assessed Values. I recognize Mr. Malizia, Kathy Carpentier, and Jim Michaud. Thank you all for coming tonight.
You're welcome.
I look forward to
You're welcome.
seeing what you're ready to teach us.
Just from an introduction perspective, I'm Steve Malizia, I'm the town administrator. I'm sure you all know Kathy Carpentier, the finance director, and this is Jim Michaud, the assistant assessor for the town. We did this presentation probably to the budget committee about a dozen years ago, and what the intent was to just bring some education to the new members at the time, and some refreshing information to the members that have been here, and also for the viewing public. I believe at some point this will either be on or be on television. And the intent is to just have a discussion and just kind of go through how tax rates are put together and how there's 3 basic pieces. Appropriations, which this committee focuses on, expenditures, budgets. Revenues, which is the non-tax revenue, things like motor vehicles and whatnot. And it's all divided by the assessed value or the value of property in town. So if you look at it, there are 3 pieces, and we just nicknamed it the Three-Legged Stool. Couldn't think of anything more exciting, so that was the name we gave it a dozen years ago. And it's easy to remember, and folks on the budget committee talked about it for years, so we figured we'd dust something off and come back and speak to the members. And I know there was some new members, and again, for the voting public and for the TV audience, we figured it would be a good idea to try to educate, illuminate, illustrate how things work. So the first part we always look at is basically the appropriations, the expenditures. That's what everybody's focusing on. What are we spending? What are we asking for? What are we looking to do? And that's typically, as you're well aware, called appropriations. And we gross budget, so we raise and appropriate a certain amount of money. And as you're aware, there's a process. Starts with the governing body, the Board of Selectmen, giving some sort of direction to the departments, department heads, level fund, come in, with a percentage change, whatever the case may be. We're looking year over year, so whatever we're doing this year, we might get different direction next year. Typically, the Board of Selectmen, and I can speak for the Board of Selectmen, tries to hold the line, tries to be frugal with the taxpayers' money, and basically gives us typically a level-funded directive. However, we recognize that things happen, things change, things break, things need to be repaired. And so the board will say, put those items for separate consideration. So when the board reviews our budget submissions, department head budget submissions, they can look at what the departments are asking for and any additional projects, tasks, repairs, items that need to be done, so that the board can have a conversation, discussion in public. That's really what we're trying to do. We have, I don't want to use the word a lot of constraints, but we have labor contracts. We have 5 unions in town: police, fire, highway, supervisors and support staff. So a lot of times we have approved contracts. Our labor base is somewhat, I'll use the word fixed. We don't have as much discretion over that unless we were to lay somebody off. I guess that would be the one way you could affect labor. So typically, when we look at budgets, a lot of times we're looking at the things we can control, things that are down in the operating budget, part of the budget. You could think of things like paving, you could think of, things like training, equipment, that sort of expense is somewhat, I don't use the word flexible, but we have some control over that. It's a little bit more difficult to control the labor, only because we have, like I say, established contracts. So, as people are well aware, we have a general fund, we have a sewer fund, and we have a water fund. Those are our big funds. General fund is what we refer to as the taxpayers. That's pretty much where your taxpayer comes into play. The sewer fund is borne by the sewer users. So if you are a sewer user in Hudson, you're paying a sewer bill quarterly, and you're financing, or you're paying for the sewer expenses. If you're not a sewer user, you're not paying. If you're a water utility user, you're paying for the water through your monthly bill. If you're not a water user, you're not paying for it. But we still have to raise and appropriate those funds. And you basically see 3 warrant articles on our ballot every year. So even if you're a non-water user or non-sewer user, you can still vote yes or no on the water budget and yes or no on the sewer budget. It's very, how do you do it, transparent. I think in the past, they were all together. This way, there's a bit more transparency. It adds a couple of warrant articles, obviously, but the intent is just to give that information to the voter. So, I don't know what slide or wherever they're at, but
Just to add on to that, in the general fund is also 2 sub-funds. The Conservation Commission is rolled up into the general fund and the library fund. So they are separate funds, but those costs are driven by the taxpayer, so it's rolled up under the general fund. We are on like the 6th slide, the approved budget. The numbers there, you can see the Board of Selectmen sends in an MS 232 to the Department of Revenue. I might call it DRA for those who know that acronym. That would be after the voters approve, any failed contracts would be taken out, or, warrant articles would be taken out. And so when the DRA waits till after they see our ballot, the official count from the town clerk, the 232 is our budget, and that's what we work off of. It started with the 737, which this budget committee signs at the before the voters, and that is the proposed budget. At that point last year, if you recall, this committee didn't recommend the bathroom project, so the numbers were decreased by that 240,000, but then the voters approved it, so the budget goes back up by that 240,000. There were 2 warrant articles, which are called special warrant articles, an IT position and a funding of a capital reserve fund for a library that failed. So again, those come out of the number. So there's the proposed budget, which is when you're done with your work, that's the proposed budget, goes to the voters, adds or deletes happen, and then the 232 form is filled out, signed off by the Board of Selectmen, and the DRA blesses it. So that's pretty much where we are at the process right now for the March elections. The appropriations have been approved in March for fiscal 19, which starts on July 1st. So that's where we're heading into. And so we affectionately call that the first leg of the stool. That's where the budget, those are all the monies that we're going to spend on the town side of the house.
and it probably gets the most attention from, obviously, this committee spends a lot of time, but the voters, they understand spending, they understand what that means. And again, it's the biggest piece, in our opinion.
So is there any questions on appropriations, or we'll move on to the next section? Okay, the next section is other revenues. There are many pieces of the revenue report, but it is tax dollars. But before we can decide how much actual tax dollars we need to raise from the taxpayers, we have to take into account other revenues. So we have like license permits and fees, we have motor vehicles, we have state sources like meals and rooms taxes, charges for services, if we charge somebody for a marriage license or, a permitting fee. We have interfund operating transfers. The water fund and sewer fund pay a small amount over to the general fund for administrative support, which is some of us, and for being in the building. use of fund balance, and then the town uses fund balance, a portion of the fund balance to reduce the taxes every year. So after those are estimated during the budget process by the Board of Selectmen, they don't become final till September 1st. So we haven't done that this year yet, because it's not September 1st. So when we did budget deliberations with the Budget Committee and then with the voters, we have an estimate, but the Board of Selectmen have one chance before September to change that. For example, if motor vehicles were to, drop off drastically, we wouldn't want to count on that. We would need to decrease our motor vehicles. Or if the state decided to increase our meals and rooms tax, then we would change our revenues at that point. We don't get down into the little ones, but if we had some big drivers, the board, Steve and I would go to the board and ask to make recommendations to change the revenues that this committee saw, because we have drivers telling us to do so. So sometime in September, we go to the board and ask them to change the revenues. That number is about $17 million, and then the rest would have to be raised on the town side by the taxpayers for the municipal rate.
So I have a question regarding the non-tax revenues. Obviously, those are somewhat unpredictable. I mean, you have past history in general.
Right,
You can see
right.
trends and things. You're never going to hit it right on the head.
No.
Is the same true for revenue from property taxes? Or is that something you can hit on the head because you know what the total assessment is? You know what the tax rate's going to be? Do you hit that, do you get exactly what you expect when you set the tax rate? Or is that?
I believe there's a modest percentage you can be off for a myriad of reasons, but in essence, yes, you are extremely close. That's what you're going to the Department of Revenue for. When you're setting your tax rate, you're raising X amount of money for the town portion, for the school portion, for the county portion. It's all predicated on, here's what was voted on by the voters, here's what's revenue, and again, we wait till September to do the revenue because we're much closer to the actual event.
Right. But I mean, the revenue from taxation. When you calculate how much you need, before you set the tax rate, I guess I'm looking at this backwards. Before you set the tax rate, you know how much money you need.
Yes.
And so you work backwards from there and to set the tax rate. And once you set that tax rate, you then get the revenue from the taxation. Is that revenue that comes in always exactly what you calculated it should be?
Not exactly. We can.
What are
if
the
you-
factors that can push that off?
I'm going to defer to Jim in 1 second, but on page 29 of the orange book in front of you, which is the annual report, is the tax commitment verification. The town is allowed to be 0.5% off of the property tax because some things can change, so there's an acceptable high and acceptable low. This is about $59 million, and that's because it includes, and we'll go over that later this evening, but that's the town, the county, the school, this local school, and the state school. So 4 parts make up the taxes. But there isn't a half percent that we're able to be off by. Do you have anything to add on that?
I don't.
Okay, so it could be off by, we'd take a chalk line of valuation, and things can change slightly. And
Maybe
he'll,
you've got an appeal here or there that lowers the assessed rate.
and we'll talk about abatements
Okay.
a little bit later.
That would be the kind of thing, though, that would make you miss, because if nobody ever changed
The
it.
appropriations don't change, so
Right.
that one, that's a given.
Yeah,
Yes.
Once we lock in a revenue, the Board of Selectmen approve a revenue, including the use of fund balance. And fund balance, as we all know, is the basic surplus undesignated, what we haven't, what we basically have left. Once the selectmen lock those numbers in, those don't change. So, we have a pretty good idea what the tax commitment is, but again, there can be little things that affect it a little bit here and there, but not widely.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so the appropriations have been locked down, voted on by the voters. DRA has blessed them. That's a hard number. Board of Selectmen has to manage to that number. And it is broken down by purposes, which would be police, fire, highway. There's many different departments. But they have, that number is 34 million, and that's all they can spend, not a dollar more. So they're managing to that bottom line. They do have the right to change within their purposes and do, a police department could be overspent, or highway's a good one sometimes if we have a lot of bad weather. You know, he is, the road agent would let the board know, but as long as the bottom line didn't go over, the Board of Selectmen have done their job by managing the budget. The revenues, we said we estimate about $17 million in other revenues, and the rest for the municipal side would need to come from the taxpayers. So that is the second leg of the stool, is the revenues, so appropriations and
Non-tax revenue, right, or basically non-property tax revenue, just to put it
other
in
revenues,
perspective.
yeah. And so, then the third leg is Jim's.
The third leg would be assessed valuation, which I believe is on page 9 of the PowerPoint. In the town report, it starts on page 31.
And by the way, the town report's online, so if someone's at home, they can actually Google onto the town government page, selectmen, and you'll see every town report for probably the last 20 years. If this one's online, if people want to look at it at home.
It's also synonymous with annual report. I think
Yes,
it's
correct.
actually another. So each year, each community's required to come up with the numbers that go into the Department of Revenue's form called MS-1, Municipal Services Form Number 1. So the front page would be the required signatures from the Board of Assessors, who are the Board of Selectmen, and then I sign it as the preparer of the document. And then on page 32, you go into some broad summary categories of land valuation. Under all is the land. So you will have residential land, you have commercial and industrial land. Those are your largest categories. Then you have current use land, which is land that has a special current use value, not market value rates. Then we also tally our tax exempt or non-taxable land as a form of keeping track of that, even though it's not used for purposes of raising revenue. Beyond land value, we run into building value. Again, similar breakdown. We have residential building value, commercial and industrial building value. Then we have manufactured building value. And again, we have non-taxable buildings like this building right here, town hall, fire station, school system, et cetera. Once we get beyond those two categories, there is a special category of public utility. So think of the electric and gas utilities that you see when you're driving down the street. That can be property that's involved in generation. We don't have any generation capacity, but if we had a power station, think, the Bow Power Station or Schiller Power Station in Portsmouth. But what we do have is we have distribution, utility valuation, utility property, and we also have transmission property. So those large transmission towers you see coming down across Canna Road and various areas of the community. So all of those values, we come up with a gross valuation before exemptions, which again is on the MS1. And we also have, as required by law, we have various exemption programs. So we start with the gross, we end up with the gross valuation, and then we say how much are we going to subtract from that for our elderly exemption program, our disabled exemption program, our blind exemption program. We do not have a deaf exemption. That is local option, but that's also possible. We have a solar energy property exemption that was recently added. So those get subtracted from your gross valuation. You arrive at your net valuation. And that becomes the denominator that gets divided into the numerator to arrive at the tax rate. So that determines, the assessment process says which slice of the pie is each property owner's, and then it all aggregates to form the basis that will support the functioning of the town along with the non-property tax revenue. It is annually required. We don't see a lot of changes in it from year to year until we hit the year of reevaluation. So we just went through a reevaluation in 2017. We're required by Constitution and by statutory law to do evaluation anew at least once every 5 years, if not oftener. Some communities do reassessments more often than once every 5 years, but we are all required to do evaluation anew at least once every 5 years. In the interim, we're also picking up new construction, right? So we become aware of building permits. We get information from inspectional services. The voters approve zoning changes that might affect value. You're going to rezone something from residential to commercial. It might be sitting next to Walmart. That could change the value of property. And all other changes that could impact value. We'll be reviewing our sales properties and discover that we don't have certain items when we're reviewing these properties. So we're going to add or subtract those items. So we come across properties that sold that we weren't informed that they filled in their in-ground pool. So that would be a deduction in value. So there's a lot of in-the-weeds kind of valuation that leads to the MS1.
Okay.
So
So-
I'll answer any questions on.
Mr. Martin?
Where does the veterans tax credit fall in this form?
So the veterans tax credit falls on the MS1 on page,
32.
page 34, thank you.
Okay, all right, I didn't see that. Thank you.
And so we have a breakout of veterans tax credits. We also have the all veterans tax credits, which will say non-combat war period era that tax credit. It's the same dollar amount, $500 per credit. We also have service-connected total disability tax credit. And that is different than an exemption. Mr. Murray?
And the elderly exemptions, any elderly person in these age categories can apply for it? Is that,
So subject to requisite restrictions. So if first of all, I have to be age 65 or older. I have to be an owner of the property. The property has to be my principal place of residence, and I have to meet certain income and asset criteria. Income would be different from single versus married. Asset could be different from single versus married. We actually happen to have the same asset limit. So there are, collars put on that will restrict people from receiving it. And those collars can be lifted. And we just recently had at the warrant article passed this year,
We raised the,
increase the amount of the income and assets for both the elderly exemption program as well as the disabled exemption program. So we'll say that these are means-tested programs, right? So the blind exemption is not means-tested. So it's not dependent upon income and assets.
thank you.
Welcome.
I have a question about the solar energy system exception. This is new.
This is new in the last 2 years.
How is, well, is really a benefit to anybody that have a solar system in the house?
So folks are, of course, installing solar systems, and some are owned by the person who owns the property, and some they're leasing their roof out, right, Solar City. And we've taken the approach that when it's leased, it's really not contributing value. At least we haven't seen any kind of demonstrable evidence. When it's owned, we've inferred, we don't have perfect, the real estate market's not perfect. We're trying to determine, does that add value? We know we're supposed to consider it, because all real estate has to be considered for value added. Think of an in-ground pool, right? So it's gonna add some value, but it may cost $25,000, but it may add only like $5,000 in value. And I think in a similar perspective for solar owned, the cost may be pretty high at the beginning, and the value added tends to be a fraction of that. As we get into a more mature market, more properties have solar, more especially properties that have solar sell. And so we can do a paired sale analysis. We can say, well, this colonial in this neighborhood is very similar to this colonial in this neighborhood. This one has solar owned, this one does not. Do they sell differently? We're not quite at that maturity rate, at least for this community. We don't have that kind of saturation. But that would be an ideal way to arrive at what is the contributory value of solar to property. In terms of the exemption, they have to apply by April 15th for the exemption. So the building permit's issued, we go out, the solar was put in as of April 1st, but we don't get to that property maybe till May, June, or July. So we go out there, we pick up the solar and put it on the property based on kilowatt, is how we choose to approach it. And we inform them that you can apply for an exemption, but you gotta apply by April 15th. So they tend to end up missing that first year, we'll say. It's not a secret, it's up on our town website, et cetera, but people are busy. And so they'll end up applying for the solar exemption for the following year. And it's required to be granted as long as they're an owner of the property and it's installed. So we have an unlimited solar exemption. So if BAE chose to put on 2,000 panels and think of, I don't know, 20, maybe more like 150 kilowatts of solar, that would be exempt. You know, we've made a decision as a community to have an unlimited solar exemption. Not all communities operate that way. I believe Nashua operates that way. And Target Corporation has made a concentrated effort to add solar to the roofs of their retail buildings. In communities like Nashua, they would not be assessed for the value of that. That's a really long answer. Sorry. Mr. Fidelli.
I have a quick question, Mr. Michaud. Regarding the elderly exemption and the disabled exemptions and the expansion of those programs, have you seen an increase in the number of new applicants or previously disqualified applicants coming back to the town? And do you have just a ballpark? I know that you haven't run numbers tonight, but
I actually have run numbers and wish I had brought them here with me tonight. Can we do a bright line test that says, because we've seen an increase in exemption value and number of applicants, is that because, well, we could identify if they're ones that used to get it that are now reapplying. I did not go out and identify that. But that would be some percentage, some number. And others would be, well, I didn't qualify before, but now we have these higher amounts. I don't have the dollar amount in front of me. I did do a spreadsheet for the Board of Selectmen that basically laid out, I'm not sure, but I'm not sure that it's all related to this increase, because we have that natural, I was 64 last year, now I'm 65, so I'm applying. We just don't have a way of breaking it out. But I believe it has had a positive increase, right, in our exemptions value.
so there were more.
There are more.
That was the easier answer.
Yeah, there are more. But there tends to be more anyways, too, unless we're doing a requalification, which we're asking folks to requalify, tell us about your income and assets again, and then you tend to see a decrease a little bit, right? Because things have changed and we haven't asked and they haven't told, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that process. So we tend to see some decrease when we go through requalification. And we do a percentage each year. During a reval year or after a reval year, we kind of tend to leave people alone on that. But then we'll start up like the second year after a reval to do another percentage requalification. Some communities requalify every single year. So they're going out to the elderly and disabled and saying, we want to see your income again. We want to see your assets again. We have historically not done that. I suppose it makes sense to go out to the ones that are very close and go out to them more often. But I diverge.
Any other questions? Before we go on?
So to bring that home, the net valuation last September was $3,071,000,000.
Correct.
Is what was prepared for DRA last year, and what was used to set last year's tax rate. Come September 1st, Jim again will be filling this form out, or that's when it's due unless we do an extension, and that would be the third piece of the stool. We know how much we need to spend, we know how much we're going to get in other revenues, we know what the valuation is, which with those three pieces, we now can set the municipal tax rate, which would also affect the county tax rate. But that is pretty much our three-legged stool before we get into the actual tax bill itself.
I have one more question for Mr. Michaud. Do you have any idea, with regard to new growth, how much you pick up in the first credit bill as opposed to the final bill? So, for example, I believe that the town's committed the credit bill at this point, and if you could respond to that.
Sure. So back in the budget process, we actually come up with an estimate. My office comes up with an estimate of what we estimate the net new real growth for the following tax year. So, or decrease, right, or flat. So I believe I estimated increase of around 35 million in that August-September timeframe of 2017. And we pick up most of that value prior to the June tax bill. So we prioritize, triage. We go out to the brand new properties first, right? It was land, or maybe it wasn't even subdivided the prior April 1st. So we'll go out to those properties first, and we tend to leave the decks and the sheds and things like that to after the June tax bill. Again, we kind of have a difficult winter sometimes, And we tend to do more work when the weather is, more work outside, I should say, when the weather is better. We pick up as much as we can for the June tax bill. And that tends to eliminate the spikiness between, I just had a land value in June, and now I get hit with this land and building. I mean, I knew it was coming, but it would have been nicer if it smoothed it out maybe for the taxpayer and the escrow company that's doing that analysis. So I don't have an estimate of how much we added for this June bill versus final bill of last year. I could easily come up with that. It's a known number now.
Okay.
So, if my assuming I own a $300,000 home in this town, that would be part of that $3 billion, and that's what my tax rate would be based on. The first tax bill of the year would be last year's rate, which was $19.72, equating to just like a $5,900 bill. Broken out into two pieces, I'd only have to pay half of it now. As we previously stated, in September, we'll do the revenues, we'll lock down the revenues, we'll lock down the new assessed value, we'll know if the growth of 35 million anticipated growth is good or not, and all of that will come together with DRA. All these forms are submitted, and then the tax rate is set, and that's when the final bill would show up in December. So that brings us back to the bill. The town, go ahead.
Good. So one thing that does get added in to the tax rate setting is an estimate of abatement overlay. So I think we might get there later. You want me to stop now?
No,
All
go
right.
ahead.
So abatement overlay is an estimate of what we think we might pay out when folks always do apply for tax abatements, right? They think the value of the property is different than what the town has, or we've got a data error on their card, or we have administrative or in-house abatements. The town taxes the property mid-tax year. We're gonna let it ride taxable because we're in the throes of that tax year, and we know we're gonna have to clear the books after the final tax bill goes out. And you wanna make sure you estimate enough overlay, so you don't have to go ask the Commissioner of Department of Revenue to open up your unreserved fund balance. But you also don't wanna estimate too much overlay, simply because that's adding pennies to the rate. So that overlay is a form of appropriation, for lack of a better word, correct me if I'm wrong, that doesn't pass through this body. It's one of the few that doesn't pass through this body. It doesn't pass through the voters, but it does pass through the Board of Assessors, who are the Board of Selectmen. And so how do we go about estimating that overlay? Well, we look back, first of all, and say, how many court cases do we have? Currently, we have a court case on assessed valuation appeal with Fairpoint now consolidated. That goes back to 2011. So we do kind of have our feet in different tax years. And then that's not as large of an exposure potential as the court case we have with Eversource/PSNH, which goes from 2014 forward. That's a much bigger number. And their opinion of values seem to be far different than ours. So we want to make sure that we've allocated some money for that potential exposure, but then we also want to allocate some potential money for overlay on, every other abatement application that might come in that we might grant. We don't grant them all. We don't grant zero. It's up to the property owner to determine how to make their argument, and the burden is on the property owner to determine whether or not that they have a good case or not. And then we'll look at it. And we're still finishing up that process now for last year, actually. So that's the overlay.
Regarding the lawsuits, so if the town wins, is that suddenly money we weren't expecting?
It is
Or is it
not.
held in escrow, or what's the process there?
That's a great question. So most of the time, we've billed it out, and for folks like PSNH and Fairpoint, they've paid their bill. So we already have the money. If we win, we succeed, our value is upheld, then the win is we're not paying money out.
Right.
That's the win. The loss, and there's different losses, there's losses and then there's losses. We're gonna have that overlay, and we're gonna be paying that money out, plus 6% statutory interest. And we are going to have our Eversource appeal heard at the Board of Tax and Land Appeals, which is one of two tribunals to appeal your taxes to beyond the local level. That is going to be for 5 weeks, 3 days a week, for 2 months next spring. I think that this is 2014 taxes, and we're going to hear that in 2019. Then whatever comes out of that is going to be appealed. That decision will come out in the fall of 19, probably, thereabouts. Then that decision will be appealed by whoever didn't win. And then it'll go Supreme Court, and then we're probably talking fall of 2021 before resolution of that.
And
In the
if
meantime, they
if the
can,
town- if the
in the
town
meantime, they
loses-
will have appealed maybe some other tax years,
Right.
so,
So if the town loses, we're gonna have to come up with that money.
but we,
No.
go ahead. Yep.
We already did. We have a fund balance, the town has a fund balance policy, and part of that fund balance policy is to take money out of undesignated fund balance and put it into designated fund balance. So I have an abatement designated fund balance, based on the cases that the assistant assessor will tell me. We have like $1 million out of the fund balance set aside for that in case we lose cases. So we take part of the undesignated fund balance, decide.
designate it.
And designate it, because it potentially has a purpose. So if we were to win, that money would go back to undesignated.
I've never heard of a designated fund balance until just now.
Well, maybe a future topic, we could talk about fund balance.
All right, we can,
So I guess that is different than just generic overlay.
Correct.
And I may have oversimplified it. There is a special account for
Which we
these known
evaluate,
dockets,
right?
court dockets.
On an annual basis, before the audit, I will ask the assistant assessor which cases we have out, what our potential exposure is. We don't even reserve at 100%, we'll do 75% for this one, 50% for this one. I don't have the number off the top of my head, I wasn't prepared for that, but it is at least $1 million, $1.2 million, $1.4 million, that we've set aside for these cases, in case we need to do that, so we don't have to hit the taxpayers.
so if the town prevails, those designated funds would then go back into undesignated
Right.
funds.
Every year, we do that, I'll call it shuffle, right? I mean, it
Because
could-
they're the less visible ones. I mean, obviously, the Eversource one is the most
Yeah.
visible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the largest,
Big
but there's
ticket,
lots of little ones probably that we never are exposed to.
Well, if they're little, they go against the overlay, the $200,000.
Right.
It's would be, I can see the list in my head, about 10 to 15 cases or accounts, I guess you'd call it. And so every year, I could increase that number or decrease it based on any action that's happened in the last 12 months before the audit happens. So it's great to protect the
Yes.
taxpayer.
Sounds like you've got it figured out.
Risk avoidance.
Mr. Murray.
I think Mr. Michaud may be more in tune to what I'm gonna say. The town of Bow just lost a tax appeals case to Eversource, and they had to pay $12 million back to PSNH out of their undesignated fund balance, and they're hurting down.
I just want to clarify that the paper doesn't always get things right. I was somewhere closer to around 9 million, which again is a lot of money. And, you take a risk when you go to trial, and sometimes there's many opportunities to settle, right? So that the fear of what the judge is going to do is a pretty good fear. And that drives you to settlement many times. For as many wins as there are some rather large losses. And a coal plant, power plant in this environmental climate, it probably it's got quite a bit of risk, right? We have distribution, we have transmission, we don't have generation. Ours is much more finely tuned, I would say, even though there are differences in value. But you're right, that's a rather large hit.
It is a large hit for a town.
And I said I have about 1 million, not 12.
But we evaluate that, we try to look at it, try to look at the risk and where we think we're at. And, every year we review that, so that's being accounted for.
So I think I could take you back to the annual report. On page 27, we already were here, but this is the tax rate. What Jim and I have tried to explain to you is just one piece of a puzzle. We just did the municipal tax rate. As you're aware, there's a school tax rate, local and state, and a county tax rate. So there's 4 pieces to your tax bill. we were mainly covering tonight the taxes for municipal, with the assessed value is applied to all of those tax rates. If you turn to page 28 on the top, you can see the overlay that Jim was mentioning. You can also see the war service credits that would affect the taxes. So the reason we brought these books today was to make you aware that they're in here. It is on the website. This is some good information. Back in the back of the book is an audit report. You can see the different types of fund balance, and we'd be more than happy to come back and have that discussion another time. I didn't intend on going down that route, but I think that was a great question. And I think we've touched on the complete presentation tonight, unless there's any questions. We'd be happy to answer.
We are, I would say, we are the collection agent for all four components of that tax rate. So we, for lack of a better word, bear the burden of that, whether it be tax collection, also assessed valuation, and also overlay. When we pay out overlay, we don't send a check to we don't send a bill to somebody else in that tax rate and say, okay, this is your portion. We have to have enough overlay to cover all four portions. We do get benefits on the municipal side as well, with the benefit of float, such as interest rates are with float. But, you know, it's part of that process. It's the same in every community. That's part of our burden, and we work well to make sure that it all flows accurately out to those other parts of the tax rate beyond just the municipal. So.
Right. I will have to say, for one thing that's different in other communities is once the tax rate is set, technically the school could ask for their whole chunk of money. The town has always operated under a monthly payment to the school, which is kind of great because we wouldn't have to go do a tax anticipation note to pay them their whole year because we've only collected half a year's worth of taxes. So it's been a great relationship, I think, financially, that we don't have to pay interest on money that we're giving to the school. So at once a month, we hand them 1/12 of what we owe them, which is great, as you said, for float, so.
What about
Of
county?
course, the county gets theirs all at once.
Yeah, there it is.
Yeah.
The county check is in December, it's boom, one big check and that's it.
But it's not as big.
What about the state education?
It's part of what I'd call school.
Right, right, so there's the money doesn't flow, everybody thinks, the money flows to the state, and then money doesn't flow to the state, the money is raised locally, it's split up into two different pieces of the tax rate, but it's the same money, it's state education money, it's local money, it's raised locally, it stays locally, local education money is raised locally, stays locally. We do receive funding, I should say the school does receive funding from the state. But, you know, the notion of state education rate usually makes people think that's something going on with the state. There isn't. It's just a different way of differentiating it, starting back in 2001.
Are there towns where it doesn't work that way, that because they're a net payer to the state instead of we're a net acceptor?
I don't believe there are any donor communities because they have a law each two-year budget cycle at the state level where they suspend the law to make no donor communities.
Are there towns where the Board of Selectmen or the equivalent are not the Board of Assessors? Are there any towns that have a separate Board of Assessors?
There are cities primarily will have a separate Board of Assessors. So City of Nashua, where I worked before, they have a separate Board of Assessors from the Board of Aldermen. Manchester is unique. They have a Board of Assessors who are also the folks that do the work, right? So they're the professionals, and they are also the ones that are making the decisions as a Board of Assessors. In terms of towns, the town of Washington, I believe, has a separate statutory Board of Assessors. This town, under the town council days, that brief period, did have a separate statutory Board of Assessors that was separate from the town council, and they had their own authority. Think advisory budget communities and not Municipal Budget Act, Chapter 32 budget committees.
Are there any other questions for our three-legged stools?
We'll think of a better name.
I like our three-legged stool.
Mr.
No
Martin?
question, but a comment. I have to say thank you to all three of you for coming out and presenting this to the Budget Committee. It was very informative, and I hope members of the Budget Committee feel the same. But thank you all for taking time to come here tonight.
Yes,
Thank
we
you.
really
If anybody
appreciate
has
it.
any questions, just
Thank you.
From KC.
Thank you for coming in. All right, we'll take a 5-minute recess to allow this group to clear out and the school administration to jump in. We're in recess, 7:50 PM. We are out of recess at 7:56 PM. So I'd like to welcome Mr. Russell and Ms. Burnell from the school administration, who are here to give us a school district overview. But before we begin, I have a few thoughts I'd like to share with the Budget Committee. After their presentations completed, I believe that some of you have your own school-related topics that you would like to raise. Looking at the contents of the handout that was distributed at this meeting by a member of the committee, I'd like to point out that some of those documents date back several years, and that this committee's role is to present a budget for fiscal year 2020, not to look back and revisit financial issues that have already been discussed and settled by the school board. Even if members have concerns about those historical events or the way the school board has handled them, there's really nothing this committee can do about them now. Many of you have concerns about the school district's methods and history of transferring budget allocations, and I want to remind this committee that according to RSA 32, and this is a quote, "Neither the Budget Committee nor other citizens shall have any authority to dispute or challenge the discretion of the governing body," that's the school board, "in making such transfers," end quote. And we cannot, quote, "dispute or challenge the discretion of other officials in the government over current town or district expenditures," end quote. We do not have the legal authority to question transfers or expenditures. Although we can certainly use historical spending as a means of informing us about the upcoming budget, I ask the members of this committee to stay focused on our roles, which are, according to the state RSA, to prepare the budget, review expenditures, to confer with other members of government relative to costs, revenues, and services as needed, and to conduct the public budget hearings. So certainly, when the presentation is done, we can have some lively discussions, but I'd ask everybody to stay focused on upcoming budgets and not on too much history, except as it may inform the upcoming budget. It's all on you.
Thank you very much. I wanted to say two things before I get going. The first one is that I'm very happy that the town gave their presentation because they did have to work for us. A lot of our stuff is very similar to what the town does. And secondly, although finance is a very big part of the superintendent's responsibilities, I had Karen come tonight because she is well-versed in all municipality finances and much more than I am. And if there's any questions that the committee had, I think that she could answer them, some of them better than I could. So the reason that we're here tonight is because I actually approached Mr. Trost on, I think after a candidates night, or might have been a different night that we had a town meeting. And I offered to come in and answer some questions that were common questions that I've been hearing over the 3 years that I've been in our school district. And I thought that instead of answering during the budget season, which typically we did, and some of these questions I did answer before, but in the heat of that presentation, I think sometimes it gets lost. So I just wanted to make sure that there are some certain common questions that they're completely answered, so that they are satisfied for, once and for all, for hopefully. So the first one is, and I give a outline to people. The first one is the dynamics of an increasing budget during a trend of declining enrollment. And that question is often asked. If the enrollment is declining, how can the budget go up? So if you want to look at the first handout, it should say 3-year budget comparison. The answer that we typically give when that question is asked is that the contractual obligations, mostly teacher salaries, or all salaries, I'm sorry, and the health benefits and so forth and so on, those are contractual obligations. So for instance, the teacher's contract was made about 3 years ago. It was a 5-year contract. So within that 5 years, there's an increase every single year that was agreed upon in the bargaining of that contract, and also the town voted on that contract in a warrant article. So those, whatever those percentage are that goes up each year are already set. The health insurance is a different matter. That can fluctuate, but typically there is an increase in that we can't control. Much like the town was talking about, some things that you can control, some things you can't control. So the salaries and benefits, percentages of change, if you look the last 3 years, 4.4 for the 2017 fiscal year, 4.88 the next year, and 3.84 the next year. Those are percentages we can't control. What we can control is all of the percentage of change. And that it went up 8.79% in the 17 fiscal year, but in 18 it went down almost 5%, and in the 19 it went down 3%. So this is what we can control, and we do try to reduce our budget. And you can see in the last 2 years that we were successful at that. But if you look at the overall increase in the budget, the total general fund percentage of change, it went up 5.4% in 17, 2.46 in 18, and 2.26 in 19. But I think what's important here is, we controlled what we could control. What has already been contractual obligations, we could not control that, so there was an increase. That's why we have declining enrollment and a budget that does go up. That's part of the reason. Another reason is we're a human-run business. So everything with us is human capital, kids and teachers, and other staff members. So that's where I think, if I'm not mistaken, I think about 87% of our budget is in the cost of staffing. So the largest impact we could have is reducing staff. And not this year, but last year, we did go down 2 staff members. And the reason that we went down 2 staff members is because kids don't, when the enrollment declines, it doesn't decline in one grade or in one school. It declines across all the schools. So you have to, reach a point where the student-to-teacher ratio is low enough that you can release a teacher or not fill that job the following year. It's usually through attrition. It's not a reduction in force. So last year, we did have a situation where there was a school where there's actually 2 teaching positions that weren't warranted for the following year, and 2 teaching positions were not allocated to that school for that year. So that we went down 2 teaching positions then. This year, I anticipate the same thing. But I will say, and we'll be talking about this in the upcoming budget. But so another dynamic that might happen is that, and we'll be talking about this in section 4 of the outline, is there are some requirements that we have to meet to federal law, to local law. And this upcoming year, we do have an increase in students with a second language, ESL students or ESOL students. And since we have an increase in that, we might have to increase that service or that department a little bit to compensate for the families' influx into the district. I think somewhere about 6 or 7 years ago, that department was at the rate that we're gonna need it at next year, but it had declined because the need had declined. People either weren't entitled to the services anymore, or families might have moved out of town, and so that department went down. We're at a rate now where there's enough kids that need services that it's gone back up again. So that's a fluctuating cost that we have little control over, because it is a federal mandate that we give students with a second language services. English is the second language, their services. Are there any questions on item 1?
Is it, go ahead. Is that ESOL federally mandated, but is it unfunded? Thank
No.
It is unfunded, but we're
Well-
not getting reimbursement by the state.
No, we're not getting reimbursement by the state, but there is, there's a consideration with the funding formula. If you have X amount of ESOL students, then you get more money from the state, depending on how many you have.
Right.
So, it's like previously, I worked in Las Vegas, and I worked at a school that was 66% ESL students,
Wow.
and 88% Hispanic, and 100% free and reduced lunch. So our allocation there was rather large because of the high needs of the students. So is it funded directly? No, but it's put into the formula. It can help you out if you do have a large population of students of need,
Thank you.
certainly.
So, I have a question. You mentioned last year there was a decrease of 2 staff members. How many staff members are there? What's the total head count?
We have approximately 425 full-time staff members,
Okay. Are those full-time equivalents or full-time staff members?
full-time staff members. We have about 650 employees.
Okay. And I'm also curious, how do you categorize them? Obviously, there's teaching, there's admin.
Yes.
There are probably other.
Paraprofessionals.
Paraprofessionals, yes.
Secretaries, custodial / maintenance, I guess,
Department heads,
department heads, yeah.
principals, and guidance counselors.
Wow. Do
Yes.
you consider the principals and guidance counselor admin or not, because they're in a school?
Well, we have
Yes,
a
some
unique situation
overlap.
with our, we have 5 unions in our district. And one of the unions is ASME. And ASME is primarily meant for administrators, but it actually has guidance counselors in it, it has school psychologists in it, and various other positions. So those are not administrative positions, but it's administrative union. So it's a bit of an odd mix, if you will. So there really isn't a straight administrative set of, or collective bargaining agreement with that. And-
How would you categorize those two positions that were eliminated? Which category would?
Teachers.
Those were teachers, okay.
Yes.
Mr. Fidelli?
I just have a question with regard to the change in the physical plan to the high school that was voted on, and if there's an anticipation in change in staff because of that change in plan.
So the warrant article that was accepted by the public, warrant article 1, the increase would be in, I'm sorry. If warrant article 2 had passed, I think there was gonna be an increase in custodial. I don't believe there's gonna be an increase in any staffing of the CTE that I'm aware of.
No increase. The plan is that they are looking at different programs and changing some programs.
Right.
But there will not be an increase in the number of staff.
And the state had asked us to do that, to add program, to entice them to give us the funding for the CTE program.
Mr. Urrutia?
Yes, how many students of ESL we have here?
I would say, this would be purely a guess of mine, but I would say somewhere in the neighborhood, but I would say somewhere between 15 and 25, I would say, ballpark.
And how many teachers work with ESL?
There is a person who coordinates that department. There is a full-time teacher and 2 part-time teachers.
Okay.
And the part of it is that all the ESOL students aren't in the same school, obviously. So there's travel involved, and there's, covering multiple settings, and that's what makes it a little bit more difficult.
Thank you.
Certainly. All set? So the second area was how priorities are set at the end of the school year, and they're set by the school board. There was questions about that. We did certainly have a person in the public who asked how the monies are spent. One thing I wanted to point out, first of all, was that we get a lot of our information during the deliberative session and during the public hearing. And one thing I do hear during that time is that people do want students to benefit from being in our schools. And it was said a couple of times during this year, at least, that people said, they literally said, "Keep my 3 cents, put it towards the kids." And so when they were speaking about that, they were talking about how we spend money at the end of the year. Sometimes there are excess funds at the end of the year, and when those monies are there, then the school board, it's at the school board's discretion to either satisfy a deed that's current at that time, or to give the money back to the public. And they weigh that back and forth and decide on typically what's best for kids.
Mr. Murray, I'm sorry to interrupt.
Can I ask how many people that was that actually approached you and talked about that?
No, I'm talking about people who spoke in public at the deliberative session and people who spoke in public at the public hearing.
Okay, I don't recall anyone saying they were gonna give back, that you could have their 3 cents.
Yep, I absolutely do.
It was.
Yeah, that's on tape.
And how many other beyond that?
I'm just talking about that time.
So one person?
No, there was more than one person that did that for sure.
Thank
Yes, Mr. Price.
I just want to speak to that. For the past 5 years, I've been on the budget committee. At deliberative sessions, someone's always made some sort of comment to that fact of it's only going to be a few more dollars. Just take my few more dollars. That's just what it's referring to. It wasn't what he was, that has happened quite often.
Follow up, Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Murray?
Just for the
It's just a
record
figure
then,
of
too,
speech.
I've had a lot of people approach me too with concerns about the cost of the tax rate for the school district too, and that they're not so generous in bringing forth 3 cents, but
Well, I think anybody who reads thumbs up, thumbs down understands there's people on both sides of the issue. Mr. Martin?
Yes, let me just point out one thing, as a new member to the Board of Selectmen. We have a general read file up in the Board of Selectmen's office, and anything that isn't of importance, but they want the Board of Selectmen to read, we read it. It's in the file, you can read it, you initial that you read it. There's a letter. I'll tell you, the letter it's in the general read, but it is from some citizen in this town complaining about their tax rate on the town. We get it all the time. The town, the school, saying that the Board of Selectmen wanted a new fire station, a new school. And they said that they were, compensated couple, and they're being forced to move out of town because of the tax rate. I don't believe it, but they try to push everything on one side. They don't see the big picture, and I think what's happening is the public is uninformed. The thing that's happening here is not one side versus the other side.
Not at all.
The public's not informed. That's the big thing.
or misled.
Right.
You're right, it's 2 sides. Okay, thank you.
And different people have different priorities when it comes to how they want their
Sure.
money spent.
Sure.
Right? I think that at the bottom of all of this is that people can have logical disagreements about what's important to them, and that's why we have elections. That's why the people can vote on the budget.
And I think a large separation is in who has kids in school and who doesn't. I think that's
Sometimes it
natural.
comes down to that.
Certainly. So, this year, for instance, I'll give it, for instance, for this year, the incident that happened in February, the tragic incident that happened in February in Parkland, Florida, there was a heightened need for safety across the country. Same thing happened with Sandy Hook in 2011. Same thing happened in 1999 in Columbine. And once again, it happened again this year in Parkland. And so safety became a large issue. And we, along with other school districts, wanted to shore up our, from a request from the school board, to shore up the safety of students in the school. And that became a large priority for the school board. And the school board had asked that if there was monies at the end of the year, to put them towards safety and security of the schools. So some of the monies did go towards that. We also had two grants that we had requested and received based on safety. And, but as I'm making that, when we start making that point, is because priorities change over time, and what you might appropriate for in the beginning might change after a year and a half, during a year and a half time. So, and that's actually my next point, is that when we're making a budget in September, October of one year, and we're looking at monies that might be left over, not the following June, but the June after that, the priorities might change over that time period, is all I'm saying. And so that's why it's up to the board to decide how that money should be spent, or how it, if it should be given back to the public, how it should be spent if they need it. So that decision is made by them. Are there any questions on point 2?
That's the question.
Mr. Martin?
Approximately 2 questions. How much is your anticipated fund balance gonna be, and how much of that is gonna go to the safety of the schools? I personally feel that use it all for the safety, because it's really needed. I mean, but although you could put all kinds of safety in place, if a kid recognizes, oh, that's my buddy, to open the door. You know, you can't prevent it. It's not, you can try to prevent it, but you could throw a lot of money at it, and it's never gonna be 100% preventable. So, in my personal opinion, take the money and make it work, and you don't have to budget for it the next season. So,
So,
Do you want me to-
yeah, sure. Go ahead,
We
Jessica.
applied for a state grant. As you're aware, there was about $18 million in the state that they are freeing up for security as one of the issues. We have received $445,000, I believe, not exactly, but somewhere in there, which is 80%. So we will be spending out of our fund balance. We have to spend 20%. That will allow us to have cameras in the, many cameras in all of our locations.
Good.
We will be having security film that will just be in the entryways. We will be having many things that aren't even in the grant. We will be putting bollards in any area that is where cars can drive into, like cafeterias, use that as an example. We will be, trying to think of what
Well,
else.
you have the access to the buildings, so right now.
Key access.
Right, so the key access, so if we, for instance, if we have an employee who we deem as a threat, we could shut their card off right away, so they
Immediately.
cannot enter the building.
software.
At that very second. So that's a big part of it. We have panic buttons that are gonna be
Panic
put
buttons.
in,
We'll be putting
in
in
the
all.
buildings. So, in key spots, so if there is an intruder in the building, it's a panic button. that goes-
Mr. Murray?
May I just suggest you stop telling people what you're gonna do for security, but understanding that you're moving forward with it?
Yeah, and I understand that, but I don't think I'm revealing anything that would be compromising the
Well,
buildings.
as someone that's been in public safety, I think you are, so.
Are you,
Different opinion.
are you spending any money on security consulting to advise you
We
on-
are. We had, well, actually, the security consulting was actually at no cost because Homeland Security had offered to come in and we had an appraisal done in every building. And a lot of our recommendations of what we're doing came from them.
Excellent.
Any other questions for number 2?
Looks like no.
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Murray?
that 20% match, can I just, out of curiosity, ask, where would you find those funds?
Yeah, there was a memo that went to the school board, and it was to come out of savings that we had within special education and salaries and benefits.
Thank you, Karen.
You're welcome.
Any other questions for number 2? The third area is auditing, legal advice, policies and procedures, and that's really Karen's wheelhouse, so she's gonna address that.
So as far as that area, I know that the town just did a great job. We follow many of the same, we have the same Department of Revenue, the same auditing firm, all of our processes, same town assessment, we kind of follow the whole thing. We also have the DOE, that is our financial handbook, that gives us all of our accounting procedures, as well as the Department of Revenue. We use the School Boards Association for all of our policies. I know that there are many talks about transfers. The school district has a transfer policy. It's not mandated. Lots of other communities just run accounts in the red. We do require transfers be approved depending on the amount of the transfer by the board. So all of the School Board Association does all of our policies. We do have a financial handbook that is our procedures, whether it's payroll, accounts payable, depending on what department it is. I don't know if anybody has any direct questions. I think the town kind of really did a great presentation.
I guess one question. Do you have the same DRA rep that town has?
Yes.
Or is it a different rep?
No, it's for the town.
It's
whether
for the whole town, so you
yes.
got one rep. Okay, thank you.
Is that everything for that area?
I think so.
I think, and I don't know if this was, in your, what you had just explained was covered, but one thing that we do is, we do make sure that the school board does see every transfer $5,000 and over, and it has to be signed up by the school board. But in addition to that, the school board is given a report of every single transfer, so they can review every single transfer that is made. Are there any questions on Area 3?
Yeah, one further question. Did I see something, I think I saw something where somebody had a discussion about going out to bid for your auditing services. Is that something that was discussed this year?
We did not go out to bid this year. We have talked about that in the past, and there's basically 3 municipal government auditing firms in New Hampshire. When you change auditors, you're going to be going back and starting, so the cost is going to more than double. So
Okay.
that is something that we do look at as to whether, although we don't change firms, in our case, we change auditing staff on a yearly basis.
Okay.
So although we use, the team that comes into our building is different every year.
Gotcha. Understood. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Anything else? Section 4, there is a common question every year, I've been here too, about, and there's I think a legitimate complaint made that and that question is asked about special education, the pat answers, well, this is a federally mandated service that you have to give, and there is obviously a lot more to it than that. In special education, a large driving force in special education is the FERPA law, which is the Educational Rights Act for families. And so you can't mention, this student is going to this school, because they could possibly identify that student by knowing that the kid goes to that school, if it's out of district, and things like that. Other than that, I think that everything in special education, just like in the rest of the budget, has to be justified equally as it does in the operating budget. A similar condition is ESOL, whereas that is mandated that we give those services. We don't have a choice but to give those services. Another area that we have to comply with the state is with the homeless, such as the homeless transportation, which was an issue in the last budget. Those are areas that we don't have a choice but to take care of and pay. But certainly, we are open to questions and scrutiny on how those funds are used. They shouldn't be shielded away from the public's scrutiny because of, because it's a mandated cost, and it's also covered by Privacy Act. The Privacy Act only goes so far. I want to be wide open and transparent about everything that we do. And even in we recently had a person from the public question our practices, and like I said, I absolutely want to be transparent and open about everything that we say and everything that we do. And I think the same thing falls for special education also. Any questions about special education or ESOL?
Mr. Murray?
So since you opened the door, if you don't mind, and you talk about special education, and this is truly a question I'm trying to understand as I work towards, a budget committee member and looking at budgets and things. But Karen had mentioned that you had some security features that you were going to do at the schools, and you were going to take the funds from special education. So how does that balance out on your, you're telling us that that's how important special education and the funding and all that is?
Yeah, you go ahead, yeah.
I'm going to start by saying that, once again, I'm going to take an example of a student. So we're budgeting a year and a half in advance. We might have a student that is outplaced at the time we prepare the budget. That person in that time frame can either come back into placement. Unfortunately, there are even instances where this person could be jailed, so we have savings in those accounts, but we have no way of knowing what's going to happen in that instance. So although we budget, students come in and out constantly. Same thing with the homeless. We budget for homeless. The last 2 years, I have been overspent in the homeless population. It has increased dramatically, but we budget based on actual students at the time we're doing the budget.
Oh, I get that, Karen, I really
Okay.
do.
Right.
But what I don't get is then, why would you take the funds from the security system for there, knowing that that's such a dynamic position that might happen?
I can answer that, because, see what it is, so a year and a half into the, early in the process, we determine like, what do we have for student needs and so forth and so on. After that year and a half is done and we're into April, May, June, like we are right now, we know that a student that we had planned a year and a half ago is not gonna be in a outplay school or something like that. So we know that, like I had a cost of one student who was in a residential school, it was $325,000. And to her point, this is how she knows it, but in this example, this student, like 2 months into the year, had been incarcerated. And so the state took care of all the costs. And we didn't have to incur that $325,000. That came towards the end. Then the school, the school board said, there is money, there is savings in there. It's not because it wasn't important, it was because of that dynamic that happened. So then towards a year and a half later, after we made that decision, because we thought the kid was gonna be ours, and he turned out not to be, then that money was there, and they took that money out of special education, put it towards safety, or whatever the case may be. Whatever they
I
want.
guess another comment is I report to the board what savings I'm going to have, and then they direct me as to
Yeah.
how the spending
I,
should
I want to remind the members that neither, according to RSA 3210, neither the Budget Committee nor other citizens shall have any authority to dispute or challenge the discretion of the governing body in making transfers. So,
Mr. Chairman.
Yes,
Point
Mr.
of
Murray.
order, okay?
Yep.
I fully understand that.
Mm-hmm.
And no one's challenging them. A matter of fact, he opened the door by talking about special educations and the funds, so
I
think
believe
you're-
you
I think
directly
you're off
challenged them.
base.
I believe you directly challenged them and said you disagreed with using special education funds for that, when this clearly 3210 says they can, that the board cannot be
I
challenged.
did not say I disagreed with him. I questioned, he asked if there were any questions, and my question was, when you're working on something like safety, and Karen mentioned that it's coming from a special education fund, where she just also said that the importance of special education and the funding of it, I'm just curious as to what their reasoning is, and I stated that.
All right,
So it's
if I
not-
misquoted you, I
It's not
apologize.
my challenge, Mr. Chairman.
If I misquoted you, I apologize. Ms. Hopkins?
Yes, I have a question about the budgeting, because, I mean, I have a bank account, and, it just flows along from year to year, but the school budget, it's a year, and when you get to the end of the year, you don't just slide everything along, right? You have to say, this is what we have extra, this is what we're doing with it, and then July 1st, you start a completely new budget year. So when you take that money out of special education, that's not money that would have slid into the next budget.
No, but it's money that potentially becomes part of an unexpended fund balance, which, the taxpayer pays for every cent of that. And, perhaps they have a concern or would like to see some tax relief or something like that.
But that
Ms.
does go-
Burnell?
That does go to 3222, though.
Yes.
My comment was going to be, and I know we're going to talk about this later, it was on the, but to talk about fund balance a little bit. Yes, in our case, whatever we don't spend does go back. The school district is not allowed to keep any of it. So usually our fund balance in the past years has run approximately $500,000. That is about 1% of our budget. Usually those savings are based on attrition or, although we budget for the new teachers coming in, if we know there's a retiree, but just change in staff or other areas like that, less repairs. But, so all of the money that is not spent by the school district does go back to the taxpayer.
And one consideration that has to be made, in my opinion, too, is, and just speaking in general, not specific, so, is that there's some entities in the state that they can carry money over and they can build a bit of a cushion, if you will, whereas we certainly can't do that. So really, at the end of the year, to your point, at the end of that year, we're gonna either be in surplus or we're gonna be in deficit. That's the only two choices that we have. And if we're in deficit, there is no money to draw on, except for in the case of special education, where we do have a reserve fund in that. But otherwise, we don't have the money to draw on like other entities could do that, so.
We would be unemployed. if we were in
Yes, we
deficit.
would.
Mr. Martin?
Yes, I just have a question,
Yes.
with regard, when you you don't take the money, you explain that, you've asked the town not to send the money over to you.
Correct.
My question is, because I'm not clear on it, is, so it stays with the town, and then the Board of Selectmen will set the tax rate, but they don't set your tax rate. So how does your returning the money
No, the
reduce
tax
your
rate is-
overall tax rate?
The tax rate is set Kathy is the one that does, the tax rate for all of us is set at one tax rate setting.
Okay, so the money that the Board of Selectmen expends during that process, the $600,000, helps offset both tax rates, town and school?
Helps offset their tax rate.
Okay,
And our unspent balance from one year, our fund balance, is monies that we had left the prior year. Offsets how much the town will give us in the new year.
okay,
They subtract.
okay. All right, thank you.
Are there any questions for number 4? The area number 5, I do have a sheet for that, and it's titled Hudson School District Local Area Assessment 2018. This is another area that we talk about every single year, and we talk about cost per pupil, so forth and so on, and that there's different formulas for cost per pupil, which, I mean, the raw formula is you take the number of kids and you divide it by the money that you have, and that's your cost per pupil. But the state of New Hampshire doesn't do that. The state of New Hampshire puts in certain qualifiers in there for ESOL, for special education, for homeless, and things like that, and that does change how the formula is done. And that's just from the monies that come from the state, which is, was it $3,600 per student?
Yes.
About $3,600 per student. The rest of the money is local. So that does change the cost per pupil and how it's calculated, how it's determined. If you look at this chart, Hudson, we really we're trying to be open about, you know, what districts we're comparing ourselves to. These are all in this direct area. Some are wealthy districts, some are not wealthy districts. We are, you know, the third lowest. We're about $2,300 less than the state average. If we were at the state average, we'd have another about $8 million, and I can tell you that would be a significant boost to any district. But I think that what this shows is that we do a good job with the money that we are given. I think that we always could do better. I think any district could always do better. Money isn't always the answer, but it is certainly part of the equation. And if you look at this, I think you can say that we're doing a pretty good job. So I know that there's differences in the enrollment, but I can tell you that Merrimack, Londonderry, and Salem all have the exact same number of K through 4 students that we do. So we do have a declining enrollment, and our higher classes have more kids in them than our lower classes. I think that same dynamic is happening in these other 3 communities also. But so right now, we have, I think it was 1,250 students in that range, K through 4. Merrimack has like 1,250, 1,253 or whatever. It's within 3 or 4 students apiece. And the reason I know that is because we work with Merrimack, Londonderry, and Salem on mental health. We have a commission that works together. When we have these, we're talking about certain things going on, we talk about interventions that we can do and things like that, and they can talk to certain things because there is more money to go towards their causes in their district. And in our district, sometimes we have to be a little bit more imaginative about what we do and how we spend our money, how we spread our money, and so forth and so on. But I think it does boil down to us doing a pretty good job because our academic achievement isn't that much different than in these other districts either. That's really all I had to say about that area. Is there any questions concerning that?
Mr. Martin?
I never understood this cost per pupil thing.
Yeah,
Is it?
it's complicated.
It is complicated. Is it the lower the number, the better you are, or the higher the number, the better you
The
are?
higher the number, the more money you have to spend per student.
Okay, so,
It's a matter of
So
opinion.
so if we were at the state average of 15,310, we'd have another $8 million to work with.
okay.
So, because we're at 12,998, we have, less money than the state
But
average.
as a comment, Mr. Chairman, my daughter is at the high school. She is getting a great education for the amount of money you're spending.
That's what I'm trying to say.
I think probably one of the best questions I ever heard of the candidates night was of the school board candidates, and that was, we're among the lowest cost per pupils in the state for our class of schools. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? And it goes to the philosophy of, are we being super frugal and getting a really great job done, or are we hurting the students? And I'm not stating an opinion, I just thought it was a great question, and it really got to the philosophy. I think that these cost per pupil sheets are great. I would, obviously, you're pulling the data from, does it come from the state?
It does.
Department of Ed.
Is there a similar table that could be made for full-time equivalents and full-time equivalents per pupil?
That'd be interesting. Yeah, well, no.
Because I think that would be an
No, that is,
interesting-
that is available from the state also, because there is a teacher ratio that's on every single report for every single district. And the number is surprisingly low, because it does account for, I think it does account for staff outside of the classroom also, speech therapists, occupational therapists, so forth and so on.
Yeah.
Guidance counselors and things like that. So the typical number I see is about 15 to 1, which is awful. That would be a great class size for anybody.
Well, yeah.
Right.
There's
but-
all the
Right,
professional
but like
level.
in the high school, we certainly have our 25 to 1s, and in kindergarten, we certainly have.
Right,
our-
because I'd like to see it expanded to include
Sure.
the SAU, and what is the cost to run the district per pupil in FTEs, in full-time equivalents? Do you understand what I'm saying, Karen? Okay. I couldn't tell from the look on your face.
Yeah, I know, I'm trying to think, I'm thinking
Where
of
you
the
could get it.
state website.
Yep,
Is
yep.
it there?
Yeah, so that would be very helpful information that would tell a different perspective on the same
Sure.
story of how well are we staffing to meet the needs
Right.
of.
So I will tell you that in Salem, they're about $1,800 more per student than we are. In that district, it's a relatively high-paying district. So a lot of that costs, so they may even have the same amount of teachers as we do, or same ratio that we do, but they pay them more, so their cost per pupil is gonna go up. So, I mean, that's certainly part of it. I know that Hudson, my understanding, before the last contract, Hudson was the second lowest paying school district in the state. With this last teacher contract, they really did try to get more towards the middle of the pack so people wouldn't leave. And I think they did a good job with that, and it did obviously raise the per pupil cost and the overall cost. But it's getting us more towards what you were talking about before, about paying enough to make sure that the kids are getting a good education.
And I'll take a moment to make a comment that I've made before, which is when you pay average, you get average.
I
And,
couldn't agree more, sir.
So, all right, any other questions or comments on this topic before?
I just make one comment.
Yep.
Just a general comment, I mean, about education in Hudson. Like I said, I've been on the budget committee for 5 years. Just my second year on the school board. I always had my doubts about things that happen in town, whether it's school or town. I'm tired of this side, that side. We're all Hudson. We live in Hudson. We all work for Hudson. But just seeing the amount of scholarships this year, the grade point averages that are coming out of school, with the cost per pupil, we're doing it. The school department's doing a wonderful job. The teachers are doing a wonderful job. They're working their butts off, just as well as the DPW in town. They work their butts off. Just my street, every time I see a pothole, the next day it's filled. I mean, the town's working. And I think the town side and the school side are all working on a shoestring budget when you really put it down to other towns surrounding us. And I think this town does a really good job. And I had to say that because I keep hearing the school, the town, we all live in Hudson. We all gotta work together, and I think we just need to understand more what's going on. Like, I didn't understand nothing about the school before I ran for the school. Now I learned stuff. The more I learn stuff, the better knowledge I have. The same with the town when I came on the budget committee. But we are one town. That's all I gotta say.
And another example of what we're trying to do with the school board and the SAU is, we absolutely do try to save as much money as we possibly can. And a good example is this year, we realized that last year we spent about somewhere between $35,000 and $37,000 on students who didn't pay for their lunches, because they were allowed to charge for their lunches and they didn't pay for them. And that number, that $35,000 wasn't budgeted for. We did have to find that money to cover that cost. And that was reported to the school board, and the school board and the policy committee made a new policy that reined that in. So this year, last year we were at 35,000, 37,000, something in that neighborhood. This year, it's down to $13,000, and the year is almost over right now. And next year, with a fresh start with this policy, we're starting at zero. This year, we probably started around 19,000 or something like that, and the number actually went down over the year. So people were paying up because of our policy. And so I think starting off fresh next year, it'll be even a better result. So wherever we can, we do try to save
So
the
this
money.
isn't a challenge against their budget line, okay?
Yes, sir.
That reduction that you see,
Uh-huh.
that you've seen,
Yeah.
why does it reduce? But why is it reducing?
What, the cost for lunches?
Yeah, you said it was
Oh,
70
because,
and
yeah,
it's,
because what happened was, our policy changed from, you can charge money and just have a $1,000 bill, to, you can only charge once you reach $25,000, you can't charge
oh,
anymore.
so you, okay. so you
Absolutely, we put a
tightened the
limit,
policy.
exactly, that's what I'm saying, that's what we did that in an effort, because the board members are town members, town residents also, and they don't want their money going towards something that shouldn't be that way too, and they did tighten that down, so I think, and that's not the only area that we do that in, obviously, we do think that there's some justice that has to be, displayed to the town of how we operate.
Ms. Brunel?
I just wanted to clarify a little bit about the way the food service program works. The way it works is because we receive federal funding, the general fund has to pay for any over expenditures that happen with any of those charges that happen within the food service department. So those expenditures can't stay within food service because they receive federal funding. And I also just wanted to say that anybody that is on, qualifies for free and reduced does get their, or anyone that has food stamps does get the free lunches. So I just wanted to clarify that a little bit.
Mr. Martin?
I understand the policy of loosey-goosey. It's a really good thing that you did this. Has any student gone?
No,
Okay, that's all I wanted to hear. Thank you.
We don't let any student go.
the student goes without eating.
Thank you.
Are there any questions about area number 5? The last area too is mostly Karen's area, and the reason we put this on here is because there is a difference between business finances and municipal finances, and actually the town, their presentation, I think, relayed some of that to the committee, and these are some key areas that do make a difference between business financing and municipal financing, and Karen can discuss those.
I don't know if we have any other questions. We had written down here that, yes, it is a bottom line budget. I think we have had that conversation this evening. We talked a little bit about fund balance, and just that municipal government is different from a profit-making business. In our district, we're about, it's all people-based. It's either about students, teachers, staff. And I think those were the things that we were just trying to bring to your attention. So
Yeah.
I don't know if anybody has,
This isn't about widgets and, how many widgets are you making and how many are you selling and so forth and so on.
I don't know if there's any questions that relate to finance.
I think the plan's going to be maybe at the August meeting. Did you have your hand up?
Yeah, and if I
Okay.
can, and save you some time, Mr.
Sure.
Chairman, I'll
Yep.
just wrap into, what I was gonna speak about
Okay.
before. So here's Sean Murray's budget committee member dilemma, okay? So we go through the budget year, and there's 400 transfers that occur at the board's discretion, fully, that's fine, that's the law, you're allowed to do it and stuff. The problem I have is because of, you have to make so many transfers like that, I have difficulty when we look at the budget lines of determining, truly what is sufficient in your line, what isn't, what lines need more money, what may not need more money. Are we is there a different way we can budget? You know, you've heard me before about planning and at least having an idea at the beginning of the budget season that if and only, you know, if we have a unexpended fund balance at the end of the year, we're gonna focus on, this is a project we've been wanting to get, and we're gonna, you know, we're gonna do that, because there are benefits. I do understand 18-month budgets, did them and went through them myself. But it's very difficult for me with 400 transfers to try and figure out, you know, what things are.
I just want to talk a little bit about 400 transfers. We do that many transfers. Transfers in our case are also when a teacher moves from one location, because our policy says that no accounts will go in the red. So if we have to move a first grade teacher from one location to another, that requires a transfer. If a para is following a student and they're going from the middle school to the high school, that requires a transfer. So a lot of our transfers are staff-related.
And they're procedural more than
And they're
anything else.
procedural. Another example, I'm just trying to think of some of the transfers. There are transfers, yes, when we decide to spend money for security. One of the transfers that I can think of is when the district decided to no longer use Aramark and have an in-house. That requires a transfer. We say, okay, this is the money that was used for Aramark. This is how we're gonna staff the department. So a lot of our transfers are related to health insurance, to people, to tutoring. If tutoring, we might budget tutoring at the middle school based on who's at the middle school, but then if there's someone that has come into the high school that needs more tutoring, money is transferred. So a lot of the transfers are educationally related, I guess I should say. The disadvantages, those are separated from the transfers that go to the board that say, okay, we want to take this bundle and move it to this bundle. I guess is how I would kind of explain.
And a point that was made earlier too is that since we can't go into the red, if we did go into the red, our transfer would be reduced dramatically, but we don't feel that's, we'd rather not. We do like the fact that we stay in the black and everything.
The district has only had a transfer policy, I don't know, it's maybe 5, 6 years. Prior to that, the accounts did stay in the negative.
Is there any way, without putting an extra burden on you and your staff, to run the budget versus actuals without the transfers, to kind of mask those or hide those?
Well,
To hide the
the
budget
financial statement does show original budget and
does,
then
it
revised
does.
budget. So you do see how much was originally budgeted and how much was transferred in.
Okay, good.
So, like, in our case, we look at by line item in the 1100s, regular education. How much was originally budgeted and how much was transferred, what the revised is? Because a lot of those transfers just go from one location to another. So there might be 40 transfers in the 1100 series, but it's gonna have no effect. Because
Right,
it just
right.
showed them going from one location to
They
another.
cancel each other out.
Right.
Mr. Murray?
So would you know what the figure would be of what the total of transfers would have been for the year? And then,
Well, it always-
and add that to the unexpended fund balance? What was?
I'm
the-
gonna back up a little bit, because transfers are always gonna equal 0, because they're going in one place and out another, so you can't
Okay.
first. So I think what you are asking is how much money is transferred into things that were not budgeted,
Right.
I guess.
Or various other lines.
Right,
moved.
right. The transfer report that comes to the budget committee, it used to be quarterly, now it's gonna be monthly, if I understand. That shows you within those areas how much is in each area.
Okay, I can go back and look at it.
I don't know if I have one in
It's right
front of
here.
me. But see, you can see how much went out of salaries and, I think it's by salaries and benefits first. Do I have one of those? No. Oh, it's on my computer.
All right, you wanna look at it?
Sorry. That was that email. So, I'm gonna use salaries as an example on this report. It shows that it shows transfers in and transfers out. So transfers in was $289,000 and out was $314. So this shows that out of all of salaries, we moved $24,000 away from salaries, is how you read the report. So looking at this, it shows that, just trying to see where it went.
I think your bottom line's on the.
Yeah, 24,000 was moved from services. In those areas, 114,000 of it was moved into technology. I know that, and I don't have all of the information in front of me, although I should, because I had it. An example is, we budgeted for, I believe it was science textbooks. There was 30-something thousand. That, because now they're online, instead of hardcover textbooks, we move that money from textbooks into technology. So that's part of that transfer. So every transfer, like, has a reason, but that's what this report shows you. So this bottom line on this report shows you that out of all the transfers, $508,000 was moved from one line to another. And it could be, although it's moved, it could be just going from Nottingham to HO or
Be in
within,
the same object code.
yeah. Hopefully that answered the question.
Ms. Hopkins?
Did we get that report and I just missed
think
it
that
in
was
my
in the
email?
email.
That was
Yeah, it was in the email.
Oh, okay. Fabulous.
There was about 5 or 6 documents attached to
There
that
was,
one.
Oh,
There
there was the
agenda
town,
and
the town financial,
Yep.
town transfer, and ours financial and our transfer.
great, thank you.
So does that complete what you wanted to discuss?
Well, yes, and in closing, I want to say a couple of things. First of all, I want to say that it's important to me that, that these gray areas in school finance are discussed so that the Budget Committee fully understands how we arrive at our decisions and how we arrive at our budget. I will freely state that I think that we are very transparent, and I think that we are fiscally responsible, and I think that is evident. There's nothing there is no ability for us to hide anything that we do, and we have no interest in that anyway. We do follow all the RSAs as they are written up, and we do have an accounting firm that comes in and audits us, and every single year, we pass the audit without problem. But like I said, I think there is I don't know if it was Mr. Murray's point before, that either misrepresentation or whatever. I want to make sure that that everyone does have the same understanding about how it works and the intricacies of it. To Norm's part, he said that, the cost per pupil, that's a very complicated formula. And in school finance, I can tell you right now, people have done their dissertations on school finance. It's a major specialty that you can have in either university or in the school business. So it's a very complicated process, and we want to make it as transparent and as simple as we can for the committee.
I'd like to make a suggestion.
Mr. Price?
If anybody in the board has time, my invitation to come to a school board meeting. We can watch it on television, but being there and hearing the questions actually asked and answered, and there's some things you can learn also. But my invitation, anybody's invited to come, the whole town, especially my past chief of fire guy can come. He can come sit next. I'll give you a special. You can come sit next to me.
Are you buying dinner?
But now you want him to buy dinner, come on.
I'm on the school board.
Not coming out of the budget.
I'm on the school board.
You get a stipend, I don't.
My wife does, not me.
Thank you.
So, thank you for coming tonight
No, my
very
pleasure.
much.
Thank you for having us.
We definitely plan on having an educational evening about fund balances coming up. I will admit that it's an area for me that it is still very confusing. The understanding about how the fund balance, how we end up with a huge fund balance at the end of every year. You saw that, I think, the confusion around that resulted in the Budget Committee's decision last year to take
Yep.
$400,000-ish out of the budget. And so I'd like to learn more about it during that meeting and some other topics that I think that Ms. Carpentier and I have talked about.
In
Could I-
August?
Could I have one more comment,
Maybe.
Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Murray?
I would like to make it clear that, you know, what the school district does with some of the unexpended surplus, such as improving bathrooms, schools, roofs, security systems and everything, that is working. It works in a sense in that you get ahead of the stuff that otherwise may take 10 years or so to go. But just once again, I'm a plans guy, and if I only, you know, even knew that potentially, you know, we're looking at fixing these buildings, because there's a lot of them in the school district, it would just flow better with me, that's all.
I think one of the problems is that for a lot of people, myself to a degree, is that when there are things that need to be done or need to happen within the school system, and the way they get done is with transfers rather than through the budgeting process, it looks like we're not doing a good job as a budget committee and as a school district in planning for those things.
And I think that a lot of our renovations are in our budget. We try to do 5-year plans for bathrooms and for, like we worked through the H.O. Smith windows, and now we've moved on to Library Street through the budget. So we are, this year, an example is safety. Those are things that we did not plan on, that we are spending. That's where all of our unexpended monies are going this year.
But I think a good example to Mr. Murray's point is like our SAU building, which we do try to upkeep. I think it was built in 1903. We do try to upkeep that building, because if it was in disrepair, and it was before Ms. Burnell got here, she's done a lot of work towards, you know, convincing the board that that building needed the work that it needed. If that does become a disrepair, then you're talking about a very big cost to replace it. I know the town of Londonderry right now, they lost their SAU offices due to mold, and they're in a business park right now paying a lot of money to do that. So, you know, to Mr. Murray's point, I think penny wise, pound foolish is the way to go.
Ms. Carpenter, did you want to approach the microphone?
Not the way to go.
Well, I was just gonna say that we should probably schedule a meeting, because in August,
I tried to add,
Yeah.
I was trying to get the attention if we had an August date. Do we have an
August
August?
1st is the
August 1st,
regular,
okay, so
August 1st is,
August 1st?
We
Yeah,
did
that's the
talk
next-
about having another joint meeting with fund balance and default being the subject.
Okay.
Good.
excellent.
I look forward to that.
Me too. So I guess that ends the discussion regarding the school presentation, and that ends our new business section. And we're left with other business and comments when we'll go around the room. We'll start with Mr. Martin.
Well, I have to say, thank you for taking time out of your busy evening schedules to be here and present your materials to us. I truly appreciate all the hard work that you do for the people in the town, and wish you much success.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Mr. Murray?
Thank you for spending time with us.
It's our pleasure.
Ms. Hopkins?
No comments, thanks.
Mr. Purnell?
I'm going to echo, thank you for coming, thank you for explaining everything.
Certainly.
Mr. Urrutia?
Well, thank you for being here with us. I have learned a lot, and I have a lot of questions, and probably at some point we'll to outreach to you with those.
Of course.
Thank you. Thank you for being here.
Mr. Price? Mr.
Thank you for coming in.
My pleasure.
Mr. Fideli?
Everybody's thanking you for coming in, and I was really very educated by what you said tonight, and
Good.
I'm glad that you were able to address intelligently and briefly all the questions that were being brought to you.
Thank you.
I think that you did better than I expected. So,
Thank you.
So a reminder that we canceled our July meeting, so there's no meeting in July. Our next meeting will be Wednesday, August 1st, 2018, 7 p.m. in this room. With that,
I'll make a motion to adjourn.
Mr. Price, we have a
I'll
motion
second.
to adjourn. Mr. Martin seconds it. All in favor, raise your hands. It is unanimous. We are adjourned at 9 o'clock.